All right, so when we look at bloodstain analysis, a lot of people think that this is called blood splatter, like it splats on the ground, but there's actually no L in there, so it's called blood spatter. It's just a fun fact for you guys. But when we come up on a crime scene and we have blood, so obviously if there's a body, that's really important. That's easy to be able to detect that, hey, a crime has been committed. But if there's no body and we just have blood, then we kind of have to work backwards. So some of the things that we have to ask and try to figure out is, did a crime occur? And remember, we said that crimes, when we look at it, there's a couple of things we have to ask. Was it an accident? Was it on purpose, so homicide? Or was it at the hand of the victim, so suicide? So that's the first thing we got to ask ourselves. Then we want to try to identify the type of weapon that was used. The reason why, if we can find that weapon, it's so much easier to trace it back to that person, to take fingerprints off of them, or look at the serial number, and the serial number was assigned to them. There it's registered that it belongs to them. So finding the weapon is super, super helpful. So looking at the patterns on the walls, we can look and see, okay, was it a high velocity weapon or a low velocity weapon? Was it something like a bat, or was it somebody's fist that actually made the blood spray out onto that target surface? We can identify how many times the person was hit. If you guys, I don't know if any of you guys are big into all the Netflix series right now that are on all the true crimes and things like that. There's one that's called The Staircase. You should totally watch that one. That one is so good because they talk about how many times was the wife hit. Did she fall down the stairs, and so when she fell and her head would hit the stairs, is that what caused the patterns? Or is there cast off from him yielding a weapon every time he'd strike her and then pull it back and then strike her again? Because when you pull it back, the blood's going to fly up over the ceiling as well. So when we're looking at that, that's going to kind of help us. Looking at the series of events, on Thursday at home, you guys are going to watch a blood stain expert on the stand at the Jodi Arias case, and he talks about how many times she stabbed the guy, how many times where he was moved, and kind of what happened throughout the timeline of those events. So that's really, really cool. Definitely pay attention to that. And then also, what did they do? Did the victim move? Did the person who killed them move the person? Was the person still actively bleeding, or were they already dead? Okay, so those are all some of the things that we can start looking at. So when we're looking at those bloodstain analysis and we're saying, okay, what do the patterns tell me? If you still haven't watched Making a Murderer yet, there's a great episode in season 2 where they bring in a bloodstain analysis and they say, could this have been caused by somebody being tossed in the back of a car? Because if they're being tossed in the back of the car, you see the direction that the body would be moving. The stains should move in that same directionality. But it doesn't. It moves up and down, which would be consistent with the defense's theory that the police planted the blood and put drips, and they just used a pipette and dropped it down, because then that would run down. So if you watch any of them, they do a really good job explaining and kind of talking through the blood patterns and kind of what that tells us about the positioning of the body. They also use a lot of mannequins. So they'll get a mannequin of about the same size, and they'll put wigs on it and put blood on it, so then you can have the idea of, if this body was actually moving into the car, how would the blood come off the hair? How would it fly? So we can try to replicate it. So we do a lot of reconstruction. So that helps us really kind of share it with our jury and say, this is what happens sequentially, step by step by step. All right, so blood. Blood is a little bit more viscous than water, which if you remember back from Science 9, I know some of you guys had me. So viscosity, again, is the resistance to flow. It's the internal friction within the molecules. So syrup is a little stickier. It doesn't flow as smoothly as water. Blood as well is a little bit more viscous too. And that's because there's a bunch of things within our blood than just a liquid. It is a mixture. We have water, we have proteins, we have obviously all of our cells, but we have acids and salts in there as well. Hopefully you guys remember the term adhesion and cohesion, right? So that's as the blood is flowing, it can stick to itself, it can stick to other materials as well. And because it's going to stick to other materials, that's why we tend to see these patterns. It's not just going to run right off the ground and then stick to the ground, okay? Or run right off the wall and then stick to the ground. Part of it will attach to the wall. Part of it will attach to fabrics, because fabrics have certain properties that make it absorb that blood, absorb that actual liquid. So things that affect the bloodstain shape. So this is one of your questions, so take a look at it. What force was applied to the blood? Okay. So remember, if I cough up blood, that's going to look a little bit different than if I get punched in the face and the blood goes flying. Versus if you get shot in like the shoulder and the blood sprays behind you, that's going to cause a different shape as well. What it actually strikes. So if the blood strikes the target surface, so that's going to be like the wall or the curtains or the couch. If you strike something that is more of a fabric, the blood isn't really going to run. It's going to get a little bit more absorbed by that material versus like on a wall or a dry erase board, it's just going to run down because it doesn't have those certain properties. So depending upon the surface of which it hits, that's what this means by the target surface characteristics. How far you are from the wall. So if you're standing close to the wall and you get shot, or if you're further away, they can actually triangulate and figure out exactly where the source of the blood was, just from all the blood droplets that end up on that target surface, which is kind of cool. The angle of the impact. So is somebody taller than you and hitting down? Are they the same height as you and hitting straight on? Or are they shorter than you hitting up? Okay. So looking at that angle, that can help us out. We can also figure out, well, was the victim standing? Were they laying down? Were they on their knees? Where were they? We can look at other impacts of liquids. So water in the Jody Arias on Thursday, they'll talk about him being killed in the bathroom and there being water there with the tub and stuff like that. Is there any movement? So movement by the victim or movement by the suspect is going to impact some other shapes as well. All right, things that affect drying time. This is another question on your actual concept check. So things that affect drying time, temperature. When do things dry faster? When it's hot? When it's cold? Hot, right? If it's very, very humid, there's a lot of water in the air, would it dry faster or slower? Slower. The amount of blood. If you have a larger pool, that's going to take longer to dry. If you have a smaller pool of blood, it will dry a little bit quicker. And then again, that target surface characteristics. So is it hitting the wall or is it hitting like curtains or fabric? Okay. So the longer it takes for blood to dry, the greater the chance that this shape is going to be changed. And so we're going to talk about kind of those shapes and what we might actually see here in a second. Types of patterns. So all these different types of patterns will make more sense once we actually start seeing some pictures of crime scenes. So here's just a variety of them. I've already mentioned cast off. That's when you're going to be wielding something like a bat, or in the case of the staircase, they use the fire poker. So hitting and then pulling back. When you pull back again, casting off from the actual weapon is important. Passive dripping, that's if I am actively bleeding and I'm standing here, gravity is going to be pulling that blood down. Okay, and so it's going to just create little drips that aren't under pressure. It's not because I'm being hit or anything like that. And then so we'll get to some of these other ones here in a second with the pictures. All right, so again, passive stains, this is one that I had mentioned where if I have a cut on my hand or if I have maybe a paper cut or something like that, I might have blood that ends up accumulating and falling off my hand or falling off my finger. If I am standing and I scraped my knee, so let's say I'm playing softball or baseball, I stole a base and I slide my knee, or I'm running track and I get cleated, I'm going to have blood that's going to start pulling down my leg. And so you'll see the runs of the blood. That's because that is caused because of gravity. Okay, so gravity still affects everything just like blood. Okay? Transfer stain is when I am actively bleeding and I go to grab the phone to call 911. Okay? There's going to be a transfer from my hand, bloodied hand, to that other surface. An impact stain is when we actually have something being hit being shot, that actually results in a dispersion of that blood. It's not that my body's actually contacting the wall, it's that I got shot and then the blood left me and it goes to those different target surfaces. All right, so again, passive dripping, this is the one we talked about with just gravity pulling it down. So you can see here with passive dripping, it's going to strike the surface typically at 90 degrees. So you have a nice circular actual stain that is left on the ground. If you had somebody that got in an altercation and the victim's now dead and the suspect is leaving, if the suspect was wounded and they are on their way out, it'd be very, very common that we would find passive dripping. So it's kind of like you can follow the breadcrumbs and see what path they took out of the house, which is kind of cool. Here's some other pictures. Now we are going to do a lab tomorrow where we look at sort of the shape. So whether we are closer to the surface or we are higher up. And so as you change that elevation away from the surface, you get different size drops. So that can give us also an indication of possible height for our suspect. Okay. When blood actually drips into blood, it's kind of cool. I have a picture for you here. You see how when it drips, oh, I forgot. It's a PDF. Are any of you guys on the, oh, you don't have this one. Man. But have you ever seen water drop into water and then it kind of sprays out a little bit? Mm-hmm. Okay. So when blood drips into other blood, that's because the person is stationary for a long time, right? If you're starting to see a pool of blood and more blood's dripping into another, okay, it's going to cause it to get bigger and bigger, and we'll also see these rays, these extensions, the little droplets out in all directions. All right, flow. Flow is created by gravity alone. So when blood hits a surface, boom, it's not going to stay there, right? Gravity is going to start pulling it down, so you're going to see lines coming down, and those lines always point in the direction. So you can see that that blood hit the surface up here, and then since then it's going to run down until eventually it runs out of that volume and it starts to dry a little bit. So you can see some of the rays, they actually made it further down, others did not. Sorry. All right, so a pool, when somebody is stationary for a long period of time and they are actively bleeding, that is what we call a pool. This is when we get a big kind of puddle of blood in one spot. If somebody is maybe tied up in a chair actively bleeding, it would be expected that you would find a pool at that location. All right, so a transfer or a contact stain, again, when you have a bloodied person or a bloodied object and then you come into contact with another surface, this is when we are going to see that transferring. We typically find this very, very commonly at crime scenes because either the victim or the suspect is actively bleeding and they're going to try to get out. Obviously, if you're trying to get out of the room, you're probably going to find blood on a doorknob or on the door. Or if somebody is injured and they're trying to get up, they're probably going to balance themselves touching other objects. So that's where you tend to see a lot of this blood get transferred. So some common objects, you can see here again on the ground, helping yourself get up. Here, calling using the cell phone. Oh, you guys can't really see that very well. But you can tell on the actual phone, there is blood on the actual phone. A wipe is when we actually move through a pre-existing accumulation of blood. So let's say you have a puddle of blood and then they dragged the person and moved the body. That's going to cause it to be moving. So if that blood stain's there, it changes the original shape. So you can see a lot of these circles. Do you see how the blood was already starting to dry here? And then they were moved. Okay, that's what we would consider to be a wipe. A swipe is when we have a target object actually moving or the victim moving. So moving your hand across the wall like this would cause a different shape. So here you can see the hand has moved down the actual wall in question. Skeletonization, this is where you have part of it being dried and then part of it is still wet. So you still see the original shape. So do you see here? Those were circular drops. Those were probably passive drops. Okay? It started to dry from the outside because that's where we have the lowest amount of blood to the inside, but then it got moved. So something moved through it, either the person, the victim, the suspect, or maybe an object got pulled through it. So we still see the original shape, but the rest of the blood that hasn't dried gets kind of disformed or moves and gives a different shape. All right, an impression is any type of transfer. So if an image that is recognizable actually is transferred, we can actually see that image. So here, what is this image? That's a hand, right? If you look, there's your hand. Okay. What about here? Do you see it? That's a face. Yeah, that's a face. So you can actually see, and a lot of it has started to dry, so that is actually the face. Yeah.
Do you, I know you can't technically tell us, but like, do you have a TikTok?
Yes.
Okay, so there's these people on there, I think they're in Florida, they're like called crime scene something. And they
Okay.
literally show, like, when they go to crime scenes, like, or like Hoarder's house, they show everything. They have a YouTube channel. Yeah.
Yeah, which a lot of the evidence and stuff like this you can get as public record. So after everything is done, they've gone to trial and stuff like that, usually everything becomes public record. You just have to go down to like the county clerks and request a file, and you would have access to those pictures.
Do you have to do a reason for seeing it, or they just
Not necessarily, not always.
weird?
Yeah.
But the problem is like, it's not just, even if there's just like a little bit on the carpet, that's not a little, okay.
That's a lot, yeah.
They have to like check and see if it went underneath, or like rip up the tile, whatever.
Yes,
because
yes,
it's
yes,
like
yes.
biohazard, so they have to get every little.
Yeah, because on the surface, I might be able to clean the surface, right? So you guys know carpet, you have the carpet that's on top, this kind of spirals, but then you also have the pad underneath, the part where it's all glued, and then an additional pad below. So if somebody's been there for a while and was laying, that blood, I might be able to cosmetically clean the top, but I can't get underneath. So that's why they would probably search all those different layers to see if there has been anything else there.
If someone like dies in a bed,
Oh yeah.
like they have to go through like every single layer of the bed. Like they can't just throw the whole bed away.
No, they gut the bed,
Got
the
it,
section
yeah.
that has the biohazard on it, and then they still have to take the rest of it.
Yeah, and they'll keep it, and some of them, they'll even keep the evidence for long periods of time because you can go back and appeal, right? So you can't get rid of that evidence. It's not like we're just getting destroyed or anything like that. But,
It's real cute with all that.
oh, I'm sure. I am sure.
This is the one that just went 7 years ago.
Yeah. All right, what is this?
Is that hair?
It's hair. Yeah. So the individual is probably bleeding from their head. All right, so cast off, this is one where I was talking about if you're wielding a weapon, so using a bat or a fire poker or something like that, where you're going to strike it and then you're going to pull the object back. When you pull that object back, that's when the blood kind of casts off. So if I am hitting somebody that's on the ground and I pulled back, where should I find blood? The ceiling and behind me, right? So I should kind of see it kind of spraying all over. So the staircase, watch the staircase, because they talk about that, about there not being blood on the ceiling.
Why couldn't you just be careful? Like, be like, stab them like this.
I mean, why could you just not kill anybody in general?
No, I'm not saying, I'm
If you're
saying
gonna
like,
kill someone and like
Because usually it's, typically murder happens because of rage, of emotions, and so you kind of lose yourself. You're not like logically thinking, unless you're a serial killer, it's like, oh, this is how I'm gonna kill them, so I can mess with the bloodstain analysis people so they have no clue what I'm doing,
I
right?
feel like if you're
I would
going
do
to
that.
kill someone and not want to leave a blood train or anything like that, just inject them with something like
Yeah.
in like a vial, and like they can't follow blood with that. There's not gonna be any blood in the house.
All right. It's kind of weird that you're thinking that way, but okay. All right, do you see up here on the top of the ceiling, you see all the little dots? You can see the lines, they're trying to connect them there as well. Those are examples of cast off. Here's some more. So if you pull back that object again, it's going to fling off. And again, when we have a pretty good idea, if we find the murder weapon, then reconstructing those crime scenes and saying step by step, this is what actually happened, works out so much better, so much easier for us to recreate it. Or we can use a variety of objects and say this is the type of weapon that we believe was used, and then they can be searching for that at the same time, which is kind of cool. All right, so again, spatter, not splatter. Spatter is our stains from the impact, okay? So you can see here, so here is an impact stain. Obviously, the body, you can see here, would have been here. We have blood coming out to all sides. We have some of them are very, very fine. You can see here we have gravity pulling it down, okay? We have different volumes and different contents at the different places, so we assume they probably were struck multiple times. So when we look at those types of impacts, it could be something like fists, somebody beating somebody with their fists, somebody beating somebody with a bat or a metal stick or whatever it may possibly be. Or it could be something like a gunshot, okay? Some of these other ones we're going to talk about coming up, those are other types of stains. So we'll see those here in a second. So low velocity, this again, low force, low velocity, maybe your fists. Tend to see this a little bit more with passive dripping as well. The dots aren't very big. They tend to be about 4 millimeters. But as you go up the higher velocity ones, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So going from something that's passive dripping to a beating or a stabbing versus a gunshot wound, we tend to see it spray and it can go different distances, okay? So obviously our higher velocity ones, the blood can go further because of the weapon that was actually used. The misting, let me show you a picture of this. This is misting, where you tend to see all these really, really tiny, tiny droplets, okay? That would be an example of misting. Projected blood, think of like, okay, I got stabbed, I'm actively bleeding inside, and then I spit it out. That would be projectile blood. So projectile blood, you can see here where a decent amount of the volume gets split out, like spit out of your mouth. And this is where we get these different shapes. That large kind of chunk of blood hits and then forms those different rays coming out from each of the sides as well. Arterial spurts. So what does your heart do? Pumps. Love dub, love dub, love dub. So when it's contracting, it's pushing that blood, right? So let's say you get cut across your neck. I know, I'm sorry. Your heart's still pumping, right? And so with every contraction, it's forcing that blood, right? So it's going to force and force and force and force just from the heart. So you can see here, relaxation, contraction, relaxation, contraction, relaxation, contraction, where they were actively bleeding and it was spraying out with different forces. But that force occurred because they were still alive while bleeding. Okay? All right, voids. So take a look here. You see how there's no blood right there? That is a void, okay? What do you think is usually in that spot then? The person, the body, right? So the body is there, and then the blood's going to be deposited around it. So that's where you tend to see a void. All right, we had a void here. You see that? So lots of bleeding over here, but then there's nothing here, but then here's our victim. Yeah. Why would a body be moved? There's two main reasons. Why would a body be moved?
Okay, wait, this is a guess though. So they can be examined by the medical team?
Oh, okay. That's a logical reason. Post-crime.
So
During crime.
It looks like an accident.
Okay, moving him, trying to reposition the body so it looks more like an accident, or the victim try to survive, right? Regains consciousness, starts to move again, and then recollapses. So take a look at this. How do you think this individual actually passed away? Do you think this is a crime? There's a lot of blood. Okay, how do you think they died?
Blood force trauma back of the head.
Okay, so bleeding in the back of the head. So you can notice that the back of the head is bloodied, and you can see it onto the shirt as well. Okay. What is this over here?
Stairs.
Where does this look like?
Basement.
Basement.
Maybe he fell down
Well,
the stairs.
They fell down the stairs. Look, what's that?
The shoe?
Slipper. What do you guys know about slippers?
Wear 'em on your feet.
You wear them on your feet, and they're horrible, right? You have zero traction. So they're going down the stairs, slip, fall. You can see that there's a post here, And you can see that they hit here, land, bleed for a long time, get up, move, recollapse back down. What's up?
He's way too frozen.
Well, again, they would have gotten up. Thank you so much. They would have gotten back up and tried to move themselves, right?
Well,
So, and then probably recollapse.
Here's my thing. Wouldn't he try to go back up the stairs and he just fell down?
Probably maybe he fell again.
I don't think that's how it works.
I don't know. But yeah, this one was actually an accident. This one was an accident, not a crime. But obviously when you see this, you would think, oh my gosh, there's so much blood. Crime has been committed, right? Technically, not necessarily.
That's not always how it
Right?
works, but still.
All right, if we really wanted to, we can get super mathy and figure out the shape of the blood and calculate at what angle did the blood actually strike the surface. We will manipulate this tomorrow and actually change the angle as we drop the blood to see the different shapes. Now it is an approximation and there is a specific way to calculate it. So if you're taking calculus, you know what the inverse sine is. But we could calculate that. As a forensic scientist, we don't get that super nerdy. We have a chart and then we just reference said chart. It's great, great. So if you're thinking of forensic science and you're like, oh my gosh, there's a lot of math in it, there is some math, but a lot of it's measurements and then going back and just looking at our table. So it's not as intimidating as you might think. When an actual blood strikes a surface, so obviously it's gonna hit, but then it's gonna get pulled down by what again? Gravity, right? So as it gets pulled down, the tail is always gonna point in the direction of that blood. Now the shape, if I am striking at 90 degrees, would I see a tail? No, I would see a nice perfect circle, right? But if I change the angle, will it have a tail? Yeah, because it's going to run down the surface because gravity then is going to pull it down. So tomorrow we're going to be changing that angle and dripping blood. And so some of ours are actually going to look like this. So when we get a different angle, a smaller angle, from where it actually drops and hits the surface, we'll see more of a stain like this. But again, the tail always points. So on this, remember how I had said with Stephen Avery, with the Making a Murder, if they're taking the body and throwing it in the back, right, the blood is striking the surface this way. So the tail should point into the car, and instead it was pointing down.
I got a couple
We focused on
episodes
that.
into that, and then I was like, there are 2 parts of it instead of episodes and not finished.
You gotta watch it. You really gotta watch it. It's pretty interesting. The first focused a lot more on the conspiracy. The second season focuses more on the actual science behind it.
Okay.
So if you can make it through the first season, the second season is really good because you find out more about the legal aspect of it and the different court cases, who they're going to, and as they keep like losing appeals, things like that.
I'm currently watching Confession Tapes.
Oh, you started watching that? I haven't started it yet. It's on my list.
It's like different, it's like a different case almost every day.
Oh, okay. So I can just pick it up as we go.
Some of them
Okay.
are 2 episodes, but it's about different people, different crimes each time.
Ooh, okay. I'll have to watch that.
One of them, the one I'm on right now, involves arson.
Okay. Perfect. Nice. I like it. I like the direction that it was moving. Good. All right. So again, when we talk about the crime scene, our goal is to be able to come back and say this is sequentially what happened throughout the entire period. So we want to try to figure out the point of convergence. So where did all the droplets come from, and see if there is a common convergence point, or our point of origin, which would be using a 3-dimensional shape, using stringing to kind of pull out from each of those blood droplets and find where that person was, where the source of blood was out in space. So this one actually uses a little bit of the stringing technique in order to be able to identify it. Again, our angle, when we look at that, this is going to make more sense tomorrow, but again, the shape of each of our droplets is going to be ever so slightly different, and that's going to be impacted based upon what surface type you're hitting. If it is less porous, less absorptive, it's going to run down a little bit more. So we can look at those. Here is that stringing that I was talking about. So coming out, trying to figure out from all these droplets, where was each of the blows located versus where the person, the victim, was as a whole. So that process of stringing can kind of help us figure out where they were as we construct it. So in the staircase one, they look at where she was struck as she goes down the stairs. Where was she originally struck? Where did she fall and hit each point? And then at the end, were there any additional blows delivered to her? So, and that one's a good one. So if you haven't watched it, you should watch it. We do have 3 different techniques that we can actually do in order to test to see if there has been blood left there, or if blood was tried to be cleaned up. So sometimes it's not as easy to be able to see blood. So think about out in the woods or something like that, where you have a lot of leaves, a lot of debris. It might not be as easy to see. So some different examples you guys can see here. Here's luminol. So you can see that blood wouldn't be as easy to see. Here would be fluorescent. And our last type, LCV, just kind of enhances that shoe print a little bit more and give us a little bit more detail that they probably are wearing maybe some type of Converses with that bottom shape. Okay. All righty.